Good afternoon. I want to welcome everybody. I'm Betty Casey, editor of Tulsa Kids Magazine, and we partnered with LSU Tulsa and the Tri-City Collective to bring you a series called Dismantling Racism, a toolkit for parents, a series of conversations about race. So our goal is to have an open dialogue about racism and especially ways that it affects families and how parents can talk to their children and have that discussion at home. And our guest for the series is Quraysh Ali Lansana. He is the author of 20 books of poetry, nonfiction, and children's literature. He's a Tulsa Artist Fellow, writer in residence, and adjunct professor at OSU Tulsa, and a former faculty member of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Juilliard School. Mr. Lansana is executive producer of KOSU NPR's Focus, Black Oklahoma. His forthcoming books include Those Who Stayed, Life in 1921 Tulsa After the Massacre, and Opal's Greenwood Oasis. And I will say that's just a very shortened biography of what our guest has done. He's also a dad, and he may tell you a little bit about his childhood in Enid, Oklahoma. So welcome, everyone. And I do want to remind you that if you would like to comment or ask questions, we do invite people to join this conversation as we talk about race. So, and I do want to remind you that you can come back for the final two sessions of the series, and they will be the following Tuesdays at noon as well. So today we're going to talk about basics. And how you can talk with your kids, and you know, especially in recent weeks, we've heard all kinds of terms and ideas thrown out. So let's just start with maybe white privilege. That's something that a lot of us hear, but what does that mean? And maybe what does the term Black Lives Matter mean? Because I think there's a lot of discussion about what that is.
Sure. Well, let's start with white privilege, since those are the first phrase out of your mouth. And I do want to thank you, Betty, and thank OSU Tulsa, my new home institution, as well as Tri-City Collective, of which I'm a founding member, for helping to make these conversations happen. And it is my goal and my hope that our conversations and these events are fruitful, helpful, educational, and meaningful for you, for myself, and for all those who are here with us in Facebook Landia. So let's start with white privilege. So white privilege, I think, if we want to find a very simple way to think about white privilege in terms of educating young people or working with your children, is to think about the fact that most school textbooks for the last 300 years, but certainly for the last forever, have been written via the lens of the white gaze, meaning that European or white American history is what's privileged. And so if you think about it in terms of African American or Black American history, as a scholar I was just on a conference with mentioned very eloquently, right, that in the United States of America, in K-12 education for the last couple hundred years or so, the introduction of Black lives in this country starts with being property, which means it starts with being worthless, or being worthless to self, but worth something to someone else, only in terms of what that person can generate in terms of income or productivity for the white person who is the overseer, the plantation owner, the slave, the master, right? And so if you start at a basic level that Black and the education regarding Black Americans and Black American history starts with being trapped and captured on the west coast of Africa and being brought here and sold as property, then Black kids will, and folks of color will look at that and say, well, what am I worth? And white children, by and large, will look at that and say, well, you're not worth much. And all of our K-12 textbooks are rooted in that knowledge, that understanding of the Black American experience in this country. That's not where Black or Africans begin, obviously, but African American or Black American history is more often than an elective than a required subject, right? And so if it's something that you can choose to, but you choose to take, choose to study, but you don't have a choice. You have to study US history. You have to study American history. And then that history is taught from that gaze, from that lens, that we are superior and you or I am inferior, then that's going to seep into the psyche of anyone, Black, white, green, purple, polka dot, right? And that those notions, those ideas are just further entrenched the older you get. The knowledge might become a little more sophisticated, but the fact that Columbus discovered America, right, or the Americas, which we all know is not accurate, is still taught because it continues to be considered the dominant narrative based on the white gaze in our history books. And so that psyche affects everyone. So again, I think for young Black children, and I'll speak about my own experience in a moment growing up in small town Enid, Oklahoma, before I left the state for 30 years. But that idea that if all I see, this is what I see myself, this is what the textbooks present to me. I don't see myself very often reflected on television, right? What Dinah, it was Bill Cosby who was the first Black person on regular primetime TV, and then Dinah Washington a little after that, right? But even still, more often than not, when Black folks are most often Black folks are in people's living rooms via the evening local news. And there are places in Oklahoma, there are places in many states where that is many folks' introduction to Black people. And if you're building your narrative based on that, and 9 times out of 10, Betty, you know that the presence of a Black or brown person on the local news is not for something positive, right? So that does the same kind of damage in rural Oklahoma or small town Oklahoma. And then you have the textbooks and K-12 education reinforcing that dynamic. And then you could add on top of that whether or not a family is open to teaching their children anything beyond who they are, which is important, but who they are and what they know. And that is how a clannish kind of mentality can manifest. And I don't mean clan with a K, although it certainly applies, but I mean clan as in, this is who we are, this is all we know. Anything outside of who we are, what we know, is suspect and foreign because we don't know about it. It's different. Therefore, it's dangerous. And white privilege suggests that a notion of superiority and a notion of, because I am white, I don't have to think about others. I don't have to engage in concern about others. I am superior to others, so there's knowledge that I don't have to possess about other people because I am white and my narrative is the dominant one. It's the only one that matters. Think about it, Betty, as an educator, about the pushback that still exists, but the pushback some years ago about teaching Spanish, right? About that Spanish should be a required language, and all that pushback that English is our language. English is the American language. And what that does, there's the message of English is the only thing that anyone needs to know, and if you don't speak English, there's you're at deficit. You're a fault. There's something wrong with you.
Or perhaps that it's wrong.
Yeah.
That another way of speaking is wrong.
Right. And then what does that do to the person who comes here from Mexico or Spain and struggles with English? Well, then then they are made to feel less than. They're made to feel inferior, because if you don't know English, then you're just not going to make it in the world, right? And what that does in terms of, again, someone's psyche, and also what that suggests about the person who's purveying or perpetuating that psyche, right? That it's, I'm here and you're here, and we will never meet. You will never reach my level, as opposed to and the other flip side of that being, I'll never learn a second language. Why do I need to, right? So that's a part, I think, of this notion of white privilege, right? It's when you think about something that is not a problem because it's not a problem personally, right? And I think that that's a really is pervasive in this state, in this city, in this country. Certainly, in the history of this state, the first piece of legislation passed made Oklahoma the most harsh. Presented Oklahoma the most harshest Jim Crow laws of any place in the country. And many folks don't know that Senate Bill number 1 actually did that, but that was the first law of the state of Oklahoma. And so we have experienced legislated segregation, legislated racism, legislated hate, as I put it, since pre-statehood, but certainly since this state was founded. And that doesn't go away because of time, right? You know, that doesn't change because it's now 2020 as opposed to 1920, right? And we'll talk more about Black Wall Street and the massacre in a bit. But that, you know, I'm thinking now about a. Well, no, let me go back to Enid, then I'll go back here. So, I grew up, and this speaks more to this notion of white privilege and implicit bias, which we're going to get to as well. I grew up in Enid, Oklahoma. I was born in 1964. So I was born a year before the passing of the civil rights legislation. Oklahoma was still under a sundowner law. So Black folks and brown folks could not be out after the sun went down. That wasn't repealed to 1976. One of the last states in the country to repeal that law. At that time, I'm 11 years old. And by that time, Barry Switzer had won at least one national championship on the backs of Black men, right, at the University of Oklahoma. And so in 1976, I would ride my bicycle downtown to the Woolworth store in Enid, Oklahoma with my best friend, Russ, who's unfortunately now deceased, who was a white man and is one of the focuses of my most recent children's book, A Gift from Greensboro. And Russ and I would sit at that lunch counter, again, 11 years after the passage of the civil rights legislation, 1 year after the repealing of the sundowner law, and we would still receive shade. We'd still get hate, right? Because there was a white boy with a young Black man at this lunch counter, right? My school, my elementary school was desegregated in 75. Again, one of the last schools districts in the state, and Oklahoma, one of the last states in the country to actually integrate, to actually adhere to the federal mandate, the federal law to desegregate these schools. And so my older siblings literally integrated the high school orchestra and the high school drill team. But when I was born, we had very separate schooling. There was very separate education for Black folks, right? And so you get to 76, you get to the repealing of the sundowner law, you get to myself and my brother, my white brother, going to the Woolworths and receiving hate for being a young Black man and a young white boy, right? I should say boys, not man. We were boys, we were 11. At a lunch counter, having cheeseburgers and malt. The law of the land is now enforced. So the folks behind the counter had to serve us, but they did not like it. And they made that very, very, very clear. And so just like historic trauma, I think the state of Oklahoma and certainly the city of Tulsa continues to experience and suffer from the trauma of not only the legislated hate, the legislated racism, but then the many ways in which that hatred, that racism permeated the legal system, the court system, education, policing, and so forth.
And Quraysh, I think what you began speaking about is that we all learn that. Black, white, whoever, we all learn that because we have the white dominant culture. I want to read a comment. Thank you so much for this. Oklahoma schools need some serious reformation, especially with the history textbooks, which is your comments. I really hope something changes before my kids begin learning American history, which of course is supportive of what you've been talking about. And then we have a question. Can you touch on how white privilege can be a factor without the white people or people even realizing it? In other words, all else being equal, isn't there some advantage to being white? And that's a problem because I can think of a few things, but I'm white. So I would like another perspective, more knowledge on that idea. So do you kind of get what she's asking?
I think so. I might ask you to go back to the question in a minute, but let me start with this. Absolutely, in a place like Oklahoma, there are white folks who have no idea that they are racist. There are white folks who have no idea.
Yeah, I think that's what she's alluding
to.
Yes.
That they have no idea that they are racist and that they're perpetuating systemic racism at all. I referenced in the article that I wrote for the magazine for Tulsa Kids, right, that I've met some of the nicest racists in Oklahoma than anywhere in the country, right? Folks who would, change a tire for you, give you the shirt off their backs, but then go home and talk about them in-words, right? And talk about how those Black folks are ruining the country or the city or whatever, right? And I think that's very, very alive in Tulsa and in the state, in part because the lack of knowledge, the lack of empathy, but certainly a lack of knowledge of history, and that again, the system actually perpetuates that lack of knowledge, which then feeds that lack of empathy. I have a section of a poem that reads, let's see, fear equals ignorance, ignorance equals lack of knowledge equals lack of respect equals hate. And I think that very bad math equation, right, adds up, right, to we start from fear. We start with fear and we end with hate, right? But that fear is rooted in ignorance, in a lack of knowledge, and that lack of knowledge could be, again, in the article I wrote for you, Betty, I asked the question, how many folks who don't look like you do you interact with whom do you interact on a regular basis? And if we all asked ourselves that question, right, it would help to speak to how insular or how expansive or inclusive our worlds really are, right? And then, so that ignorance also goes to, again, knowing about histories and stories and paying attention to folks who don't look like you and their realities that don't look like you, right? One of my favorite quotes, again, from Miss Clara Looper, Oklahoma's most noted civil rights leader, which I opened the article with, right? Ms. Looper said that my biggest job now is helping white people understand that Black history is white history. We cannot separate the two, right? And I would add to that, that my job is also, in addition to helping white people understand that Black history is white history, but helping Black people and white people understand, particularly Black folks and folks of color, that their histories are important, just as important as the histories that are, and the ways in which those histories are taught and spun in our K-12 textbooks. So fear equals ignorance, and then ignorance equals lack of respect, right? And respect is, regardless of your faith, regardless of your spirituality. Respect is simply just that you are alive and I am alive and we are humans, and we should coexist in a way in which you can do your thing and I can do mine, right? And we can respectfully disagree as long as we were respecting one another, right? You know, and then so fear equals ignorance, ignorance equals lack of respect equals lack of knowledge, right? And lack of knowledge equals hate, right? And so I think I messed my own quote up. But the idea there is that we start with fear and we end with hate.
Right.
And that's really what we see even playing out in the news over the last several months, and even as recently as yesterday, surrounding the debate about the removal of the Black Lives Matter mural from Greenwood Avenue, right? But I'll pause there for now because it looks like we have some questions.
Well, and I have another question that goes back to the previous question. I think her point is that no matter who anti-racist a white person, how anti-racist the white person is, they still hold white privilege. So so
that's true.
I think understanding that, but also, you speak about rural communities or Tulsa itself being a very racially stratified city. And
it is.
We have been forever. I mean, you may not see a Black person. You may not see a person who is different from you in rural Oklahoma.
Right.
So how helping people understand. I mean, I think I kind of understand what some of these people are saying, that, we don't need to know these things.
Right.
Why would I need to know these things? And, they live in their own bubble.
Right.
So, and they're also easily able to say, well, I am not racist. Right. I don't understand why you're saying I have white privilege.
Right. So yeah, exactly. And to that person's point, you're absolutely correct. You can be anti-racist and still experience white privilege because that's the dominant culture. That is the ways in which our everyday interactions in life and with at the grocery store, at the gas station, what have you. Young white men don't experience being followed around a grocery store or somewhere like Black folks do. That's implicit bias as well. But yeah, there certainly one can be experience white privilege and anti-racist simply because of you're white. Absolutely, that happens every day. And I think I spoke to Betty with you earlier about how I've been encouraged by the number of white allies who've been engaged in protests in Tulsa and around the country, Portland, Seattle, so on and so forth. I've been really really very pleased in many ways with that, or encouraged, I will say, because I think there are young white folks in particular who understand that they understand what Black Lives Matter means, which is that it's about what is happening to Black and brown folks, and that they are empathetic and sympathetic and see it and acknowledge it and want to change it, right? And not the general, and not sort of perpetuating the normal pathology, which is, in my opinion, that pathology is, if it's not me or mine, we don't care. Right. And that goes back to that clannish, with a C, not a K, right? That clannish mentality that I mentioned earlier. And that clannish mentality can happen and can manifest in South Tulsa. It can manifest on the south side of Chicago, which is predominantly Black, where I just came from. Right. So it's that clannish mentality is not specific only to white folks or specific only to Black folks. I call it a national pathology. But what makes it, I think, in many ways more profound is when white folks who also benefit from white privilege, right, which is much more sinister and insidious, can also engage in this idea of if it's not me or mine, we don't care, because now that includes everyone who doesn't look like them.
Right. You spoke, you used the term implicit bias. Would you like to talk about that, or microaggression? I think those are some other terms we have heard, and I also see some more questions coming up. So
you want to go to the questions first, and then we'll get back to that.
Questions, since people are interested. Okay. We've seen Tulsa Public Schools perpetuate racist double standards when it comes to holding the only Black school board member representing North Tulsa to a different standard than all other members. We see her voice marginalized as policies in the name of the greater good are passed, which disproportionately affects her district. What suggestions do you have for opposing this expression of systemic racism? And I don't know if you're familiar enough with that situation to be able to answer that, but it goes to the point of education and systemic racism.
Well, I'm not. I need to, and I thank you for educating me with that question. I need to touch base, or to do a little homework on that in specific. Yeah. In general, I'll say this, and we all know that education funding is tied to property taxes. We also know that most of the folks living in North Tulsa are renters, or a good portion of folks, depending on which part of North Tulsa you live in, because it's not a monolith, right? But a good number of folks who live in a certain areas of North Tulsa, probably more to the east side of North Tulsa, are renters and not homeowners, which means someone who doesn't live in the community owns those homes that they rent, and may not keep that. They may not pay attention to those homes very well. The upkeep on those homes, and the tenants may also not be very good tenants. And in some instances, probably not all. And just like in some of the instances, homeowners are not all bad. But what we do know is that property values feed education funding. And if the property values are low for whatever reason, then the monies that are going to go to the schools, to McLean, to Hawthorne, to other schools on the north side are going to be much less, much more reduced than the monies that go to schools in Midtown, let's say. And so that is a manifestation of systemic racism, right? That, and another very profound example of how systemic racism damages the future of Black children, Black and brown children. And so until we can find, and again, there's a great question that I need to do some more specific homework, but until we can find other solutions to get funding to our schools to help support them. And now the White House is threatening to, remove the funding of any school that doesn't go back in person, which is dangerous, just dangerous. And I'm being polite here because it's midday, but it's dangerous. Also, so there are schools who can't afford that cut, right? Can't afford that reduction, 5% reduction in their federal funding, because they're providing free lunches and breakfast often for these children, and places for them to be as well as to learn. And so I think that we have, and until we can address other ways, inventive ways to address the funding gaps in North Tulsa and other troubled communities, which I think we all have to, and that includes parents, that includes students, that includes all adults who care, right? Until we can do that and make a concerted and consistent effort to do that, those young people will continue to struggle and suffer, and that's a part of our future. That's we need to change the narrative from despair to the well of Black brilliance and talent that North Tulsa possesses. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think, I've lived in Tulsa for many years, and it has always been the case that the inequities in the schools are prominent. And I think not only understanding that, but hearing those voices and listening to those voices and not pretending that it's invisible, that North Tulsa is invisible is important for people in their life.
That's well put, Betty. That's very well put.
Question. I also struggle to monitor and recognize my own implicit and explicit bias on a daily basis. What is the best way to help us as parents talk to our children about doing the same?
Great question. I think number one, depending on the age of your child, I think it's about introducing the histories and the stories of other cultures and other peoples to them through means that they will ascertain and experience empathy. So whether that's, I believe in books. I'm an author. So books, and I also believe that books, unlike film or video, books require us to engage more critically, more internally, and therefore we learn more deeply. That's my opinion as an educator. But I think it's about introducing other people and other cultures to our young people as early age as possible, so they understand that there are other folks in the world, other folks even in their own block or neighborhood who don't look like them, but are equal to them, right? Going back to this white privilege idea, right, is to, I believe that no one is better than anyone else. Some people are better off, but no one is better than anyone else. And if you're defining your self-worth on being more better off than I am, then okay, more power to you, as long as you're not beating me down in the process of suggesting that you're more better off than me, therefore I'm inferior to you. That is a disease of white privilege, for sure, right? But I think going back to the original question, right, so dispelling this notion, right, of one of those other sort of awful regular kind of comments regarding race, which is that I don't see color. No, we want you to see color. It's a lie. You're lying to yourself, right? I will never forget, again, the best friend that I referenced a little while ago when we went to the Woolworths together in 6th grade. As young men in our 20s, he was dating a young Black woman, a mutual friend, a young Black woman, and he took her home to meet his mother. I mean, and mind you, again, this was my best friend for 33 years until he died. At that time, he was still alive. We'd probably been best friends for 25 years or so, right? My brother. And he took this young Black woman home to meet his mother without telling his mother that she is Black. There was, because she's still alive, that she's Black, right? And I went off on him after he told me that he had done that. I love this dude. He's my heart, right? Miss him every day. But I had to go off on him about how wrong that was. So even my best friend, and what he said to me was, well, you're my brother. You were here almost every day. I was like, dude, but we never dated, man. We weren't dating. I'm your brother. That's different, right? So even my best friend, even he got tripped up on the white privilege that he didn't need to tell his mom that he was bringing a Black woman home. And his mom lost it, politely, but she lost it. And so it introduced to him a side of her he had not seen that I knew of, because I was his best friend and his best Black friend. So I already had experienced these things that he evolved in, he grew up in. So they were just kind of normal to him. And then we meet one another in the 6th grade, and I still experience these things, but he's evolved in these things and raised in these things. And then he brings a Black woman home and it slaps him in the face. And then I have to say, dude, what are you thinking? What have I taught you? Nothing? What are you thinking? But even this idea that, I want you to see color. I need you to respect color, right? One of the crazy notions that was put out there for a while after President Obama was elected was that now we are post-race, right?
Yeah.
So what does post-race mean, Betty? Break that down. What does that mean, Betty? Right?
Now, I think that you're hitting a good point, because there is research that I've read as a parenting publication editor. I get all of the research.
Sure.
That young children recognize differences even infants recognize skin color. They recognize people and things that are different from them. Right. And to say that I am colorblind, or to tell your child you need to be colorblind or post-race, whatever that means. Maybe that's a cereal or something, but we need to understand the kids see color.
They do.
And so I think this is Beth's question about implicit and explicit bias, that she having her own awareness as a parent, I think is like the major first step.
It absolutely is. To be conscious of it in yourself, and just think you can do it. You can put yourself through a simple, very painless test, right? So think about the things that you prefer. You might prefer black shoes. You might prefer red hair. You might prefer your toast to be extra crispy, right? You think about the things that you prefer, and then you think about the things that you don't like, right? The things that bother you, the things that that are not as comfortable or as welcoming to you. And you ask yourself, in the process of those things, sort of think about the opposites, right? So if I think about it this way, as sort of a game. If I prefer black shoes, I don't prefer white shoes, right? Or whatever, right? And think about it that way. And then look at the things you prefer and think about why you prefer them. Is it because you were introduced to them by your mother at a special moment? Or is it because you were introduced to them by an ex-boyfriend at a great time in your life, or a girlfriend or whatever? You start to think about what is the source material for these ideas, right? And then apply that same sort of thinking and sort of logic game to other ethnicities. Why do I prefer white folks over black folks? Or why do I prefer black folks over Latinx folks? Or why do I prefer First Nation or indigenous people over black folks? And then ask yourself the same sorts of questions as to what is the source material for me to think this way or think in these ways. And what you will learn about yourself is a lot of things that will be rooted likely in the way that you were raised, in the environment in which you grew up, and the sort of the birth culture, we call them birth culture in terms of the way that you were raised, and culture of choice, your friend groups. That folks don't like to always believe this, but friend groups in high school can often shape, or even younger, can often shape the way one thinks for the rest of their lives, because they're at the foundation of your growth. And so play that game. Start with shoes. Start with something light and non-threatening, like shoes or bubble gum, I don't know. And then go to ethnic groups or sexual orientation, or, and so on. And then sort of think about, write them down if you need to, but think about what is the foundation for these ideas, right? And so implicit bias is that I believe that every time I see an older white man, and I'm 55. So every time I see an older white man, I assume the dude is racist. That's implicit bias. I'm flipping it, but to make my point. Of course, not every white man over 55 is racist, but a good number of them are. So, but the idea of, if I walked around the world thinking every white man I see over 55 he's just Jim Crow Jr., then and so I'm going to avoid that person. If I have to interact with that person, I'm going to interact with that person with my guard up always. That's implicit bias. So flip that from the white perspective. Do you feel like if you harbor the notion, and we don't even, sometimes it's so ingrained, Betty, it's so second nature that it's just, again, depending on how you grew up, how you were raised, where you grew up, it's just second nature, right? That I see a young Latinx man, and so therefore he must be an illegal immigrant, right? And so we form those sorts of narratives in our brains, and then we just perpetuate them.
Well, and it's also reinforced constantly to us.
Constantly.
By our culture and in school.
Constantly, particularly, and that's also, again, I'm glad you brought that up, because that also supports and validates those ideas, right? Yeah. If I learn, right, that again, that Africans came here as property and had no worth and no value and no contributions other than how much richer they made some white plantation owner, you're just as worthless now as you were in 1619. You know what I mean? So because that's what's perpetuated, other than if you're in an end zone. If you're in an end zone, you're okay, right? If you can score a basket, or, I have, again, one of my former student poets in Chicago has this great line that asks, when's the last time you cheered for a Black man who is not in an end zone? And that's a real question, And she wrote that, and she was in high school when she wrote that, right? But that's a real question.
Yeah.
So back to the original question, introduce your children to as many different cultures as possible. I suggest books. I suggest music. I suggest, again, culture. I believe that art is one of the best ways to teach other cultures, because everyone can find a place for respect and interpretation that's valid in and via art. So whether that's dance, music, visual art, poetry, literature, what have you.
Yeah, and I think listening to you, it goes back to your poem about fear and starting with fear, because the way we can dispel fear. I love these questions because as parents, we make choices for our children. So we're choosing the neighborhood we live in. We're choosing, as you say, the books we read to them. We're choosing the different perspectives that we're providing for them.
Right.
All of these things that you're talking about, we as parents can look at ourselves, yes, but then we can also make those choices for our children.
Right. And it starts with us as parents, because we are our child's first teachers, right? And so what we introduce to them, what we reinforce to them is the stuff that will really stick.
Right. We have another question, and this may be beyond your experience here, but I'll go ahead and read it. Title I funds have been used at TTF novice temporary teachers in frequent rotation in North Tulsa schools, TFA, etc., and other communities of color. This creates a cycle in which students do not have access to experience highly qualified educators and contributes to student outcomes that are less than stellar. How do we pressure school districts into understanding that such distributions of Title I funds actually contributes to poor outcomes for students? And is that implicit bias in allocation of public funds? So I think that maybe goes to the question of there is always implicit bias in Tulsa. It would be North Tulsa schools, but in right. schools that are predominantly poor right. or people of color go. So I think that's kind of the question, is why are the resources less than
right?
Why are they getting the inexperienced teachers or et cetera, et cetera?
I think, again, part of it goes back to what I was saying about property values funding education. property taxes funding education. And also, again, in the United States of America, there's this idea that to make money, you have to have money, right? And so, and that's also really a very troubling sort of truism, but it's troubling and it's true at the same time. I believe that a part of that is that many folks have already sort of written those schools off and written those neighborhoods off and written those young people off as we can't save them. So we're just going to put our money somewhere where we can actually feel like we can do more or work more, save more children by giving them more resources. But again, I think that's still rooted in property taxes, but I also think it's rooted in implicit bias as well. I think that to the other part of that question, the best way, or one of the best ways, I'm sure there's more than one, but one of the best ways to address it is for community groups and the parents in the areas to engage, to be engaged enough. And I'm praying that they are where the person who presented this question, that the parents have to become engaged enough, the adults in that area have to become engaged enough to bring pressure, collective voice to the entities who control these funds. And that's got to be as many adults, teachers, and I know teachers are in a very fragile position right now. I'm mostly speaking to parents and guardians and community activists and the pastors or faith leaders in these areas who all have to come together and say, this is wrong, we're going to change it, because the power is in the collective voices, right? And you have the power in that collectivism to affect change, either certainly in terms of your presence and numbers, your demands, and also what you can do economically as a collective group, like pull your money out of, stop spending at different places, stop supporting different entities. Your money talks, but so does your voice. And so that's what I feel like right now. And I'll think about some other things, but off the top of my head, it's the powers is in a large group of folks who are committed to addressing this issue, coming together and being consistent about it. It's not about I went once and they didn't listen. It's about every week or every city council meeting or every school board meeting or whatever. It's about always being a consistent voice for change, having a plan to present, and being there and using that voice and also using that power. Go ahead.
I love that you said that, because you know who that reminds me of is Representative Lewis.
Right.
The idea that we sometimes assume these times in history, these things that are accomplished in the past are inevitable, right? That these things, but they weren't. They involve somebody consistently, as you were talking about, consistently being there, consistently being that voice to affect change. And it's difficult, but everyone can do it.
Right.
And I think that's one of the reasons that I really wanted to have this conversation is, one person, look at what one person can do. We just lost somebody who spent an entire lifetime trying to work for change. So I love that you say that, being that consistent voice, because we don't know, sometimes you just have to hope that what you're doing will make a difference.
Right.
And other people will listen to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But would you go back? You sort of touched on the this is the thing in Tulsa right now, the Black Lives Matter sign.
Mm-hmm.
I think there might be a misunderstanding of what that means and maybe what that represents, because you see other people wanting to make other signs. Well, I'm this or I'm that. I'm a Blue Lives Matter. It's not. Is it just about Black Lives Mattering, or talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think for me, the simplest sort of explanation or metaphor for Black Lives Matter is as follows. There's a house on fire in a neighborhood, And the firemen and women come and they put water on every house that's on fire. I mean, every house that's not on fire, but the house that's on fire burns down, right? And so following that metaphor, right, they put water on every house that's not on fire, but the one that's on fire is ignored and burns to the ground, right? And so that's what I think about when I think about Black Lives Matter, that we have experienced for 400 years or more, Black folks, when I say we, a profound legislated and systemic racism from the moment we were denied our freedom on the shores of Africa, brought over here in ships, sold on auction blocks, and then forced to provide labor to make white folks wealthy so they could have the time to dream and spend their money and make their money and build the most powerful nation on earth. But that could not have happened without Black folks doing the labor to make the money and dying and being forced into dehumanizing situations to live in them for hundreds of years, right? There's no way that this country would be the greatest nation on the earth in terms of certainly economic might if it weren't for 450 years of free Black labor, period. Wouldn't exist, right? And so understand that just like I have a friend in Enid who inherited his family's 150-year-old business, and 150 years ago, my descendants were sharecroppers and just out of chattel slavery. And understanding that that's privilege too, but that's real history, right? My folks were sharecropping for somebody else, couldn't even own the land. And he inherited his family's business, hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, right? All because I'm Black and he's white, right? That's so understanding that when we say systemic racism and that Black Lives Matter, it goes all the way back to that to 1619 and that history through Jim Crow and Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and beyond to this current moment. And the notion that we don't believe, Black folks, we don't believe, like I said, that we're better than anyone else, right? We're certainly not, most of us aren't certainly better off than most others either. The idea is that the pain and the trauma, the legislative systemic racism and how it's manifest and affected our lives in almost every possible aspect of civic engagement, of education, of everything, of healthcare. The fact that the mortality rate in North Tulsa is 11 years less than the mortality rate of folks in South Tulsa, same city, should shock anyone of any ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation. Just there, you can drive from one side of town to the other in 15 minutes. One of the things I love about Tulsa, right? But that's 11 years off of someone's life. The further you drive up Peoria, right? How does that exist in one town in the United States of America, right? How does that happen, right? And that should speak to everyone on this call and anyone and everyone else to what systemic racism is and can do and how it manifests, right? That Black women die given in childbirth at 34%, I believe, higher rate than white women on the south side of Tulsa, right? What is that? Well, there's not a hospital in North Tulsa. Let's talk, can we start there? A grocery store is being broke, a ground on a grocery store has finally been broken in the last month. So it's still a food desert, and it may not be a food desert very long, but that grocery store, you know, and grateful for it, is that Peoria and Pine, I believe, yeah, Peoria and Pine, there's still miles and miles of North Tulsa that don't have access to a grocery store, right? So when you think about systemic racism, It's easy for folks to see police brutality because it's sensational and it's brutal and it's ugly and it's in your face and it happens too damn often. But there's the other kinds of systemic racism that are just as insidious and less sensational, like education, like healthcare, like food desert or food access, like the criminal justice system, the legal system, home ownership, being eligible, getting loans, right? There's so many other ways in which this institution of systemic racism is alive and well, just like it was in Bull Connor's Jim Crow, just like it was in Reconstruction after the Civil War, and so on. And so that's Black Lives Matter is saying, hey, know this, see this. Can you look beyond yourself for a minute and see this for what it is? If you're capable of doing so, then help us, join us, help build alliances to change these situations.
Great. There's a comment that sort of goes to that. She said, I did an assignment where we look into various community resources. We were to visit grocery stores and research schools. It helps create an understanding of marginalized communities that we as teachers serve. So this is a teacher. I feel like more of our community leaders need to do the same type of assignment so that they might be more invested in change, which is what the type of change you're talking about, and opening your eyes to it.
And I agree. That's a great comment. Couldn't agree more. And think about it. And again, give thanks for our teachers. And I just want to make sure for all the teachers who are on this call, on this event, I want to say thank you, and that I honor you, and that I admire and I respect you, and that you're in an incredible situation right now, and you're in an incredible situation being a teacher in Oklahoma because you're not being paid what you're worth and what you deserve. But absolutely, the community leaders and others need to engage in this knowledge, this work. I mean, on the one hand, the equality indicators that the city has put out every year now for the last few speaks to these incredible disparities, right? And so I heard a great quote recently from someone who's like, yeah, the city's data driven, but what are you doing with the data, right? Yeah. What are you doing with it? We see the equality indicators, and we see the disparities. Thank you. Are we done now? It's like, are we done? What are we doing with this knowledge? We see it. We can go. It's like, thank you, City of Tulsa, for telling us what we already know. What are we going to do to change it? What is your plan to change it? And maybe that's on us too, right?
Right.
Maybe that's on us too.
I think so. Well, we're getting toward the end. I do want to remind people next week, we'll be talking to teenagers about their experiences with racism. And I also want to make sure that you guys know that the third series in the series is about resources. And we will have those up on our website as well. So I want to, a lot of these things that we're talking about today may require educating ourselves. I do want to recommend the podcast 1619, which is a great overview of some systemic racism and how it infects all areas of society. So Quraysh has graciously agreed to help us come up with a list of resources. So I'm really excited about having that as well, because I think we all need to educate ourselves a little more about what we're doing. So
just buy all of my books. You just buy all 20 of my books should be good.
Wait. I have, this is great. Quraysh wrote this, and it's really a wonderful book about his own experience. And so if you have a child, this is a wonderful book, and it gives some of his true story of his friendship with the white friend. So thank you for being here. I want to thank everybody who watched today and listened today, and I admire all of you for being part of this conversation. And Quraysh, it was a wonderful conversation. I learned a lot. I think OSU Tulsa and Tri-Cities Collective as well. So thank you.
Thank you,
And
Betty.
come back next Tuesday at noon.